So I'm over in Moscow. I'm waiting to do this interview. It gets out that we're doing it. And I'm immediately denounced by this guy called Boris Johnson, who was for a short time the prime minister of Great Britain. And Boris Johnson calls me a tool of the Kremlin or something. And I'm thinking, well, that's kind of, I mean, his name's not actually Boris, as I'm sure you know. His name is Alex Johnson. He called himself Boris in high school. So the guy who calls himself Boris is accusing me? So I was annoyed. So I put in a request for an interview with Boris Johnson, as I have many times, because he's constantly denouncing me as a tool of the Kremlin. He says no. So I'm thinking about saying I'm getting more annoyed. So I know a lot of people who know Boris Johnson. So I reach out to them. Finally, one of his advisors gets back to me and says, he will talk to you, but it's going to cost you $1 million.
Around the world, people are watching that ludicrous interview with Vladimir Putin conducted by Tucker Carlson, and we must not fall for this tissue of lies, above all for the notion that Putin is somehow fated to succeed in Ukraine. On the contrary, he is doomed to fail. Read about it in the Daily Mail.
Yeah, somebody replying to this video, if Boris Johnson charged 1 million for an interview, how much did he charge Biden and the military-industrial complex to sabotage a peace deal and ensure more endless war? This is crazy.
Putin wants to negotiate for peace. He does not want war, and says, doesn't the United States have better things to worry about? Don't you have issues on the border, issues with migration, issues with your national debt, more than $33 trillion? And basically says, isn't it in your best interest and easier to negotiate a deal with Russia? Putin also claimed in this interview that he almost ended the war with Ukraine months ago, but that Boris Johnson ruined the peace deal. Tucker said, I think you're saying you want a negotiated settlement to what's happening in Ukraine. Putin said, right, and we made it, and we prepared a huge document in Istanbul that was initiated by the head of the Ukrainian delegation. He said that the CIA was responsible.
According to this article, Tucker Carlson blasts Boris Johnson. In raw of an interview, he's sneezer and lower than Putin. Going down on the article, Tucker Carlson has slammed Boris Johnson as being a lot sleazer and lower than Putin after the former prime minister refused an interview with the American journalist. Johnson said he was prepared to hold a debate with the X-Fox News presenter who interviewed Putin earlier this month for 1 million. Carlson said that Johnson had demanded a 1 million payment for himself, but the former prime minister said this was untrue, saying that the money he wanted for the interview will instead be donated to Ukraine charity.
So I'm over in Moscow. I'm waiting to do this interview. It gets out that we're doing it. And I'm immediately denounced by this guy called Boris Johnson, who was for a short time the prime minister of Great Britain. And Boris Johnson calls me a tool of the Kremlin or something. And I'm thinking, well, that's kind of, I mean, his name's not actually Boris, as I'm sure you know. His name is Alex Johnson. He called himself Boris in high school. So the guy who calls himself Boris is accusing me? So I was annoyed. So I put in a request for an interview with Boris Johnson, as I have many times, because he's constantly denouncing me as a tool of the Kremlin. He says no. So I'm thinking about saying I'm getting more annoyed. So I know a lot of people who know Boris Johnson. So I reach out to them. Finally, one of his advisors gets back to me and says, he will talk to you, but it's going to cost you $1 million. He wants $1 million in US dollars, gold, or Bitcoin. No, this just happened yesterday or 2 days ago. And I'm like, he wants $1 million. Yeah. And then he will talk to you about Ukraine. He will explain his position on Ukraine and explain what. So he attacks me without explaining how I'm wrong, of course, or how he's right. This is, by the way, the guy who single-handedly, at the request of the U.S. government, stopped the peace deal in Ukraine a year and a half ago and is, I think, for that reason, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. He won't explain any of that to me in an interview until I pay him $1 million. And I said to the guy, I just interviewed Vladimir Putin. I'm not defending Putin, but Putin didn't ask for $1 million. So you're telling me that Boris Johnson is a lot sleazier, a lot lower than Vladimir Putin. Would do it anyway. And I enlisted some non-Russians I knew who I thought might be able to vouch for me, et cetera. And it took a couple of years. And ultimately they said, yes, we will do this. But if news of this interview gets out, we're canceling the interview.
Wow.
So I started to get, so this is the best part. I got calls. I got a call from a New York Times reporter, and then a friend of mine got a call from another New York Times reporter asking when I was interviewing Putin. And there's no way they could have known that. I didn't tell anybody. My wife, my producers, not even my kids. I didn't tell anybody. One of my children was highly annoyed to learn I was in Moscow. Why didn't you tell me? I said, because I didn't want to text it, But no, they clearly did it again. They leaked it to the New York Times in an effort to scuttle the internet. And I just, again, I hate to be, Mr. Stubborn principle guy, but that is a principle worth defending. I'm an American citizen. I have not committed a crime. I can speak to anyone I want. I can have any opinion I want. And you're not allowed to use your creepy spy agencies against me because I'm your boss. This is a democracy. Aren't you always telling me that? But again, nobody cares, so I'm going to stop the lecture on that. But it did motivate me to keep going. But my real motivation was I just want to know what's happening there. We're in a war with Russia. We've never had a vote in Congress on whether we should be in a war with Russia. No one's ever explained to me why we should be at war with Russia, why I'm supposed to hate Russians. Why am I supposed to hate Russians? We've got an awful lot of things going on here. The country is in very tough shape, especially right now. It's completely out of money. We're bankrupt. And so it does seem like we should have more information before we send another $60 billion that we don't keep track of to.
Yes, Boris Johnson had previously accused Carson of acting as a tool for the Kremlin after it emerged that he was interviewing the Russian president, after which the US journalist reached out for an interview. Okay, you cannot know something, you cannot know the truth on something if you don't get from both sides. Tucker Carlson revealed this. I didn't know that Boris Johnson could actually do that, demanding money for an interview. When he started receiving massive backlash on social media, he came out to debunk the news that was untrue. I was asking that money to give it to charity organization in Ukraine. So Tucker Carlson is the one to give you money to give charity organization. That is what he's claiming. Boris Johnson knows the truth. That what Putin said was nothing but the truth. They wanted peace. Since they are all warmongers, they had to sabotage it. Look at where we are today. It's still continuing. It's not stopping. I believe Boris Johnson is very happy. Yeah, he's extremely happy to be observing how people lost their lives on daily basis. I don't know what some people actually gain from these wars. Seriously, I never expected, to see that. But Tucker Carlson interview made it clear, so we should understand who is the bad guy.
We should think about what that means. One. Two, the West doesn't spend any time, or our policymakers in Washington spend no time thinking about what are the achievable goals here. I have heard personally.
Industrial revolution.
Or anyone would describe Davos as protecting liberal democracy. And elites tell us that open borders and even illegal immigration are okay.
And divided by class. My spirit.
Are you sure?
I think this is Donald Trump's fault.
Wait. Watch this.
Water there?
I hate my job.
Yeah.